Welcome to memoQ Talks, where we talk to industry leaders about their experiences, lessons learned, and what works best across all areas of localization. Now here's your host.
Hey, Kate, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good. We had some technical difficulties there, but we managed to work through them. It looks like, I'm assuming that's not a hotel room that you're in. It looks like you're back home finally.
It would be a pretty awesome hotel room, in my opinion. But no, this is my office. So as messy as it is.
No, it looks like a pretty awesome office. I want to talk to you about the presentation that you gave at the Seattle Localization Users Group back in June, which kind of blew my mind. I was like, whoa, why haven't I ever thought about this stuff before? But before we get into that, maybe we can talk a little bit about your background. I'm in awe of you, by the way, because you have a Wikipedia entry. I don't know how I could ever get one, but
I don't know. I don't know how it got there, but somebody put it up there.
Well, it says that you are a geographer, a writer, a content culturalization strategist, and very active in information-based cartography and video game content. There's a lot there, but I think you're probably the second cartographer I've ever met in my life. Can you talk a little bit about your background, how you got into cartography, and then kind of where that led you to in terms of your current roles?
Yeah, well, my career path was kind of bizarre. I mean, a lot of us have kind of weird starts when we get into our career. For me, my first aspiration was to be an astronaut. And I did aerospace engineering for 1 year, and that kind of, the calculus killed me. So I'm like, no, I had artistic skills. So then I said, well, I'm going to be a conceptual artist for Lucasfilm. So I did industrial design for 2 years in school, which really improved my storyboard art style and conceptual art style and all that stuff. But then I got a little disenfranchised with the program I was in. So I just changed my major to geography because I figured, well, I always love travel and culture and maps and everything. And of course I could bring those artistic skills and use them in cartography. And that's essentially how I got into it academically. And I worked for a year after I got my bachelor's degree. I worked for a year as a cartographer, making maps for Thomas Brothers Maps. Some people might remember those old Thomas guides.
Oh, yeah. How could you get around pre-iPhone, man? You have to have the Thomas guide. Where is it? Where am I?
So that was fun, but then I was just compelled to go to grad school and kind of explore the topic more, which took me from Southern California to Seattle, where I studied at the University of Washington, and I did my master's thesis in geography on using virtual reality for cartography. And that was back in 1991 when VR hardly even worked. So that was fun. And then as I was starting my PhD, the department I was in, the geography department, got a call from Microsoft, and they needed a cartographer to come over and work on Encarta Encyclopedia, which was just starting out. That was back in 1991. Yeah. And so I went over there and basically became a contractor and did a bunch of the maps, most of the maps for Encarta Encyclopedia version 1.0. And then they just kept renewing my contract to help them with other projects with cartographic help until they offered me a full-time position a couple years later to create a new kind of position called a geopolitical strategist to help them with all the kind of really complicated issues in maps, like how do you show Taiwan, how do you show Kashmir, all these disputed areas and areas that are not agreed upon around the world. And so that was my initial job at Microsoft until a couple years later, I had the idea to create a new kind of team at the company, which I called Geopolitical Strategy, to effectively help all the products at Microsoft avoid making political and cultural mistakes that get them into big trouble. And so after I pitched that idea to 5 different VPs over 7 months, I finally got one of them to say yes, who incidentally was the only one who was not from the US. He was from South Africa. And he instantly understood what I was getting at. So I created that team and basically ran that for 7 years until I left Microsoft in 2005 to become self-employed and created my company Geogrify. And but that's when I started working on video games pretty heavily because that was part of my mandate, not just working on Windows and Office, but everything at Microsoft. So for me personally, being the geek that I am and the game player that I've always been, doing culturalization work on video games to me was like the perfect job. And so when I left the company, I'm like, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on pretty much on games. And ever since, it's pretty much the majority of my work is video games.
That is awesome. And I want to talk about the work that you do with games, but just to unpack what you said there or kind of reflect on it, I think there's some lessons to be learned there. You know, a lot of people, when they look at university, they look at the outcome, like, you know, how much am I going to make from this, or what field of study is going to give me the biggest ROI. So, you know, and you followed your interests and you changed up your interest after a couple times, but, you know, you went after things that you were passionate about. That led to getting a call from Microsoft. Who got a call from Microsoft, man? But Microsoft comes knocking on your door back in 1991. That is awesome.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, there's some lessons to be learned there. Before we get into the video game thing, though, I want to talk a little bit about the fascination with maps, because I'm looking behind you there and I see the maps on the wall. Personally, having lived, you know, 20 something years overseas, which started with me looking at maps and then reading Lonely Planet books and just, I get fascinated, and they're almost dangerous to me because I'm like, oh, I want to go there. I mean, like even like fictional maps, like in, you know, Lord of the Rings, you're looking at Middle Earth, and I'm like, oh God, I want to go to the Misty Mountains, which you can't really do. Well, you can, you know, in an imaginary way, but it's like, I love maps, and there's something there. I mean, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated as well with maps, and I fondly remember this old globe that my brother and I had when we were young, which he would sometimes throw at me. But I mean, but it was
two purposes, dual purpose, right?
what else? That's what older brothers do. So, but the globe, I remember just spending so much time looking at the globe and looking at atlases, just like many kids do, and just kind of daydreaming and thinking about what's there, who's there, things like that. But honestly, when the real inspiration for becoming a cartographer started kind of rising up, it was really, honestly, Tolkien's map of Middle Earth is what inspired me. Because, you know, I, like many kids, I had read Lord of the Rings way back when, and I you know, absolutely love the books and have read them many times. But it was his map that kind of gave me the idea that this is world building. You can use cartography to build a world that doesn't have to be real. Even though doing real cartography for the real world is fun. But it was just that idea that we as human beings ascribe so much truth to the image of a map because we just feel that if we see a map, we just assume it's the truth. And usually it is, but not always, especially depending on where the map is from and why the map was made. But it's just so many people. In fact, I would say the great majority of people I talk to, anytime I mention that I'm a cartographer or map maker, they're just like, oh, I love maps. I've never met a single human that said, oh, maps suck. I hate maps. Nobody's ever said that to me. Now, I also play the bagpipes. I have said some people say, oh, I can't stand the bagpipes. That I understand. But maps, yeah, I think there's a universal love for it just because it brings to life so much of our imagination, whether it's about the real world or a fantasy world. And that's part of what I really love about them.
Totally agree with you. And back to the bagpipes, I can imagine like if my kids said, hey, I want to learn the bagpipes, and they were really poor at it for like several years, and the neighbors were just hating it. You know,
yeah.
But we might have to move. But back to the maps, one more thing before we get into video games. I just read a book about the founding of Astoria down in Oregon. And it talked about, you know, Captain George Vancouver and these other early European sailors who came and had mapped the whole Pacific Northwest. And I was just like, how did they do that? Because like, you can't get super close to the shore, right? I mean, you have to kind of follow and parallel it. And I guess they're using sightings from the stars and different things. Yeah. But I mean, how did they do it?
Well, I mean, basically, as you sail up the coast, you know, you're obviously keeping track of where your latitude is and your position as best as they could back then. I mean, by the time Vancouver was around, we already had a pretty good understanding of how to measure latitude with the stars and the sun angle. And then we also, by that point, had also, because of the advanced watches that were created, were able to measure longitude as well by that stage. And so with those two things at hand, it was basically we could position ourselves on the globe. And then as you're going up the coast, you're taking sightings and readings and doing distance sightings. So you could basically, you know, you kind of map what you see because in the old days, what they do is kind of closely follow the coast and do their best approximation. But sometimes, in a few centuries earlier, like when the Spanish were exploring North America, especially from on the Pacific side, the initial surveys when they went up the coast, they saw the tip of Baja California, and they assumed that it was an island. And so, because of that assumption, cartographers started showing California as an island, and that idea perpetuated on several pieces of cartography for 400 years.
Wow.
Even though the Spanish, including Cortez himself, when he went to Central America, he sent one of his captains to verify it. And the captain said, it's not an island. It's just a gigantic bay, the Gulf of California. And yet there was, for political reasons, some people in Spain basically kept pushing the idea that it's an island. And so that just kind of kept perpetuating. And of course, back then, cartographers kind of copy each other. Because oh, that map shows it as an island. That one does too. So I guess it must be an island. And part of the reason they did that is because they were basically kind of asserting their claim. The Spanish were against the British, who were also exploring in that region at the time. And so showing it as an island, at least according to the laws back in those days, was more advantageous for asserting their authority or sovereignty over that area. And that's why it was perpetuated. And so it's like it went on for so long that I think it was 1860s, there was a Japanese map that showed California as an island. Still,
I would love to get a copy of that. That'd be so cool, man. Well, I guess that's kind of a good jumping off point into the topic of the metaverse and some of the issues with creating a kind of unified metaverse. And and I never even thought about this before your presentation. As you mentioned in the kind of introduction, that people tend to look at the technical difficulties.
Yes.
And the technical difficulties will eventually probably be solved, probably in the near future, but it's more the cultural kind of difficulties. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, like having done my master's thesis about VR, I am a big believer in the technology. I think it's super cool, and it's come a very long way since 30 years ago. So I still love the technology, but when we have people talking about this concept of the metaverse, which is mainly kind of a science fiction vision, based on William Gibson's Neuromancer or Neil Stephenson's works like Cryptonomicon, and you've got Ready Player One and all these other great science fiction books that have kind of given us an idea, and of course The Matrix, about what a metaverse could be. And I think that's all great. Obviously I'm a huge sci-fi fan, but in our world, when I see that, these people are saying, well, hey, it's just a technical problem to solve. We're going to have a real metaverse in a few years. And I'm like, it doesn't matter the technology. We will figure that out, as you said. The problem is, like, the question I typically pose back to these people is, you tell me when Chinese, Russian, and American users are going to be in the same space seeing the exact same content. And I don't think I'm going to be alive when that happens. Not to get morbid, but it's just, we are currently in an age where information is being fragmented on different platforms for various reasons, whether it's political or social. Obviously some governments like Russia and China, they have laws that basically block external internet because that allows the government to kind of shape reality for the citizens, that it's in their jurisdiction. And so with that, as you're shaping reality and kind of blocking external influence, you're actually starting to fragment reality so that, people in Russia, people in China, people in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere that does this kind of activity, they start taking on a different perspective of what the world it really is. And I think cartography serves a really great example of that, because much of my work in cartography is very similar. Because, for example, Google was one of my clients for 6 years, and I helped them perfect what we call domain tailoring. And what I mean by that is that when you go to Google Maps, you can go to different internet domains and you will see a different version of the map. So like in northern India, there's the Kashmir region, which is highly disputed between Pakistan, India, and China. And India, by law, requires the territory to be shown as Indian territory, just like China requires parts of it to be shown as Chinese territory. And so if you take just that one dispute, you've already got 4 versions of reality you have to manage. The one where it's all disputed, the Pakistan version, the Chinese version, and the Indian version. And so those realities are completely not compatible because of the geopolitical dispute. And so in a similar analogy, when you think about the metaverse, there's certain kinds of information that some governments will allow or not allow its people to see. And that's why I think this idea of having us all in this massive, holistic democratic space, I love the idea of it, but right now it's pure science fiction. And I just don't see the trend line heading in that direction anytime soon, because that's not what we've been seeing over the last 10 or 20 years.
Yeah, so what are some of the toughest decisions that game publishers, for example, have had to make in terms of some of these geopolitical issues?
Well, I mean, some examples we've had to deal with, like, for example, I've worked on all the Age of Empires games over the years. And in one of the early versions, we had to change history for the South Korean market, because one of the scenarios we had in the game was one from the Middle Ages where Japan invaded the Choson Empire, which is what Korea was called at the time. They invaded the Korean peninsula and almost took it over. And so the developers felt, hey, that's a great scenario to put in a game, because you're going to play as the Choson and stop this massive Japanese invasion. But so that's what we put in the game. And when the game came out, it was banned by South Korea because the Ministry of Information of South Korea said that never happened. Their history books do not describe that as ever happening, that the Japanese did an overwhelming invasion. And so basically they said, you're not selling this in our country. So back in those days, though,
what if you pitch it as fiction? I mean, because are you saying that we can't even have a fictional story that runs contrary to the historical narrative? Because that's pretty heavy-handed.
It is heavy-handed, and the answer is no. They would not accept a fictional argument, because some governments, South Korea is a good example, they are very protective of their culture and history. They don't want to see an alternative viewpoint like that basically paints them in a light that is not favorable to them. Just like one of the games I worked on years ago was a science fiction game that took place 300 years in the future. And in the science fiction world, there was basically like an Eastern faction of Russia and China, just kind of like what's happening now. And then there was a Western faction, which was Europe, the US, and Japan. But in the game, the US, Europe, and Japan were actually one government. They were one entity. And so they created a flag in the game that used the Japanese Imperial War flag, the Rising Sun flag, and a bald eagle in the middle, and then the European stars around it to represent this new government in the future. And we actually had our developers who were working with us in Japan, they rejected that whole notion, even though it's science fiction. It's just an idea for the future. They said,
because of the imperialistic flag, or because of the...
Not necessarily because of that, even though that was a problem that we were going to change. But what they objected to was the idea that Japan would ever actually aggregate itself with the US and the EU as a single political entity. They said, we don't accept that idea.
It's science fiction, man.
I know.
So they're probably not big fans of Tarantino films where you have history that is kind of just not really history, but
yeah, the alternate history. Whereas you have some of those alternate history narratives are very popular, like Man in the High Castle, one of my favorite Philip K. Dick books, and I thought the Amazon adaptation was pretty good. They did a pretty nice job, asking the question, what if the Allies had not won World War II? What would have happened? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important for us to be able to ask those questions. But, sometimes you have different governments and different cultures that are much more protective of their culture than others. And so we have to be mindful of that when we're making these kind of decisions.
Yeah, I think you also gave an example about the jacket that Tom Cruise is wearing in Top Gun.
Yeah, so that one is really recent, because it gives a great example of what's going on with China right now. Because, China is now the largest film market in the world. It's also the largest gaming market in the world. And yet, so many films, many game developers, they're striving to get into that market. It's not easy. It's a challenge to get into the market because of the content restrictions and logistics of setting up business, etc. But with film, I mean, most films today, they really want to get into China. They feel it's imperative that they sell in China. So, for example, there's when China has a map showing its territory. One of the things that it's known for is what's called the 10-dash line, which is a line that China shows of their assertion that they own the entire South China Sea and Taiwan. And so some films have been banned in the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam. So like an animated film from DreamWorks called Abominable was not shown in those three markets because it showed China's version of the map, showing the claim over the South China Sea. Last year, the Uncharted film, which was based on the video game Uncharted, they did the same thing. They showed that same map, and they were not shown in those three countries. And then even this year, a couple of months ago, the Barbie film did the same thing because they had a brief world map during the Barbie movie, which also showed China's claim line. The reason it was banned in those three countries is because the Philippines, Malaysia, and Vietnam are all part of that dispute, and they do not want to see China's viewpoint asserted like that. And so similarly, Top Gun, in the original Top Gun film, Tom Cruise was wearing this leather jacket, which would belong to his father. And on the back of the jacket, there was some patches. And two of the patches were the flag of Japan and the flag of Taiwan. And so, okay, no big deal. Well, when the trailer for Top Gun Maverick, the sequel, showed the very first trailer, what it showed was him wearing the jacket, and they showed a picture of the back of it, and the Japanese flag had been changed, and the Taiwan flag had been replaced by just something completely different. So it's supposed to be the same jacket from the original film, but it's not the same jacket. Now, obviously, the filmmakers made those changes because China does not want to see the Japanese flag and definitely doesn't want to see the Taiwan flag. So that's why they changed the jacket, because they wanted the film to sell into China. But thanks to COVID, the film didn't release right away. And so what happened is it gave enough time for this backlash to really foment on the internet against that image of the jacket. And it got so bad that the producers actually made a very conscious and clear decision that we're not going to sell into China. So we're going to go in and use CGI and change the jacket so it looks like the original film. So now it shows the Japanese and the Taiwan flag. And so that was the decision they made. So Top Gun Maverick never released in China, and yet it still made, I think, almost $2 billion worldwide, which is not bad for a film. And they said that when the film released in Taiwan, on the premiere night, they said theaters were erupting in cheers when they saw their flag on the jacket because, they won. They won that battle for mindshare, and they got the production to basically, keep it the same as it was in the original film. So, yeah.
So how do you advise, in situations like that? I mean, do you say, well, like, look, here's the upside, here's the potential downside, here are some options. So, I mean, let's talk about it like in a video game scenario. And, I think one of the other examples you touched on was we can call it the Sea of Japan, or we can call it the East Sea, because in Korea, if you go to the east, that's the sea. But if you're in Japan, it's actually to the west.
Yeah.
And historically, there's, or there's the islands out there. And I don't want to, go too far down into that specifics on that dispute.
Right.
But how do you approach providing advice in those scenarios?
Well, generally what I have to understand, and when I work with any client, is I have to understand the baseline values that they have. Like, what are they willing to change or not change? Because it's different for every company, and it's different, honestly, for every individual creator. Because, are they willing to make changes? Like when I mentioned that Age of Empires example with Korea, what we ended up doing was releasing a special patch only for Korea that actually changed history. So now in the game only for Korean players, Korea is invading Japan rather than Japan invading Korea, which that didn't happen, but that's what the players there see. So, there was making that change created a big debate about ethics and truth with a capital T. People on the team were saying, I don't understand why we're doing this. We're serving up government propaganda. And they're right. That's exactly what we're doing. But that's the cost of business. That if you don't do that, then you don't sell in that market. In exactly the same way with the three films I mentioned showing China's claim line on the South China Sea, that's the cost of releasing the film in China, is to show that boundary. If you don't, then you're not going to release in China. It's that simple. And it really is that simple, that it's one thing like that. Just that one boundary line makes the difference between selling or not selling into the market. And so my advice to my clients is when I sit down with them and try and understand, what are your goals? What are you really trying to achieve here? Now, naturally, with most games, You want to sell everywhere. You want to maximize your revenue.
Money, that's my goal.
Money, that's it. You want to get maximum return on investment, which I totally get. But at the same time, you have to be conscious of what precedent you're setting as a company. Like, for example, you could be saying, I'm willing to do anything for money. I will change anything. I will change history. I will change facts. Just, bring it on. So that's one thing. And you as a company or as an individual creator start taking on that reputation. Hey, this person will do anything. So yeah, if you want to sell into China, go to them because they don't mind changing history. They don't mind changing, facts and all that kind of stuff. But other companies, they want to take a line. They want to, draw a line in the sand and say, we're not going to go that far. We're basically going to stop and think about it. For example, when China announced a couple of years ago that they were going to put greater restrictions on showing LGBTQ representation in games, they don't want to see that, especially same-sex relationships. So that one message a couple of years ago from China was like a deal breaker for a lot of clients I work with, because the clients I work with who are mostly in the West, one of their core values is inclusivity and diversity. And so if they have human characters in their games, they want to show same-sex relationships. They want to show LGBTQ representation. And so China's declaration, basically for some of those clients, they said, that's it. We're never going to try and sell in China. So now we're not going to worry about that anymore.
No, that's an interesting example, because that falls out of the kind of geopolitical discussion and more into terms of social norms and kind of regulating them. And I think sometimes people underestimate how heavy-handed different governments can be. I don't know if you follow Matt Taibbi and the Twitter files here in the U.S., but even the U.S. government was in with many of the different social media platforms, asking to deplatform these people or throttle down these organizations, etc. And it's it's a similar kind of almost parallel kind of activity, and that happens here, but in where we have freedom of speech. But in countries like China, obviously, there's a lot more control. You brought up the Korean game. I recently had a conversation with a solution engineer at NCSoft, and he talked about an approach that they take in terms of allowing their game players to communicate with each other, and they use their own proprietary machine translation. Now, if I'm in Japan and I want to refer to Takeshima, which Koreans would call Tokto, and this is a very hot topic, right?
Yes.
They had to make a decision. Does the machine, the MT engine, does it translate it as into Tokto, or does it translate it as into Takeshima? And they took which I thought was a pretty kind of enlightened view. Don't know if it's going to work, probably backfire on them, but the enlightened view of, you know what? We feel that if this person is the kind of person that wants to use that language, then we should let them use that language, because that best represents who they are. And that brings a certain level of authenticity to our platform. And so far, it seems to be working out for them. I mean, what are your thoughts on an approach like that?
Well, in a lot of ways, to me, that is similar to the domain tailoring approach that we took with Google Maps, in that you basically allow the system and build the technology to allow for meeting local expectation. And that's actually, like the talk you mentioned that I gave about the metaverse, that's actually one of the suggestions I mentioned, where I think if and when we have a metaverse, that's exactly the approach that I think we're going to see first, in which if we do have a shared space where people of all kinds of different cultures can go online and interact with each other, I think what we're going to be seeing is we're going to see content filtering from the source, so that even if you have Chinese and Russian and American players, for example, in the same metaverse space, that will be allowed, but what they will see will be different. So, for example, if there is somebody with an avatar and they're logging in from Taiwan, and maybe their avatar has the Taiwan flag on a T-shirt of their virtual character, but the Chinese player or user, what they will see is not the Taiwan flag. It might be blurred out. They might see the Chinese flag instead. I mean, the system will be able to do that, and that is the technical interoperability piece that can be solved and is not that difficult to solve.
Yeah, but that's a little bit different than the approach from NCSoft. NCSoft is saying, hey, if the player wants to wear the Taiwan flag, we're going to let them wear it because that's who they are and that's how they want to express themselves. Now,
Right.
but their examples was with machine translation, if they in terminology of disputed areas and stuff. So there's a little bit different. What are your thoughts about like just letting people? Is that going to just cause countries to say, no, it's not going to, we're not going to let you sell in here?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I personally love that approach. I think the approach they're taking is smart because I would love to see more of a space like that where, you just allow people to express themselves how they want to express themselves within limits. Obviously, we don't want, like extreme hate speech and other things to arise either. But then you're going to have to start drawing a line and basically decide, okay, because
how do you define
what's hate
it?
speech exactly? So that becomes a whole nother conundrum. But I think, allowing that I think is great. And I think that's a good baseline approach to start with. But I do think, and I will not just think, I know that they are going to hit a limit where, for example, in Korea, if a Korean player wants to call it Takashima and not Dokdo, that's going to be a problem for the Korean player. It's like,
he better not like let people know where he lives. Put it that way.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. So, so I can see where that's going to have implications, not only on the system, but on the individual user who's interacting with the system. And that's why I do think that kind of approach is great, but I think it's not as realistic on a global scale. Because
sense.
managing because in a way, what's happening there is that rather than managing reality by jurisdiction, meaning by country from where the user's logging into, the system that they're using is almost like managing reality down at the individual level. So basically, you're managing millions of different realities versus having like players from 50 countries. So you're managing 50 realities. And so that to me is going to be the biggest challenge for them, especially when it comes to community management.
Makes a lot of sense. Let me ask you, in your space, what are some of the most exciting and or worrisome developments?
I think that, one of the things that I think is really interesting right now is we're seeing, a tremendous amount of gravitas and kind of momentum happening in the Middle East, which tends to be still the fastest growing gaming region in the world. The Middle East and North Africa region, well, Middle East and Africa together, they have had over 12% year over year growth for several years now, compared to 6% growth in Asia Pacific, around 7-8% growth in Latin America. Europe and North America are pretty small. I mean, their growth numbers are like 2 or 3% because they're mostly saturated markets. Right. So we're seeing a tremendous amount of people playing more and more games in the Middle East and Africa. And yet a lot of games that are created, especially from for people not in those regions, they're not really targeting players in the Middle East and Africa. That's not really who they're thinking about as their typical player. So I think for a lot of big games, both AAA and mobile games, it's something they need to have a bit of a shift in what their assumptions are about who the typical player is. But on top of that, we're seeing a lot of activity in the region. I mean, it's well known that Saudi Arabia, for example, is spending a lot of money investing in the video game sector. They've got several companies that have arisen, like 966, which is a publisher. We've seen a lot of initiatives going on. I was in Saudi Arabia at an event at late August this year called the Next World Forum, and it was sponsored by one of the crown princes who is head of the Saudi Esports Federation. So it's like you've got this direct tie to the crown, who has a vested interest in video games. And for a lot of people, though, that is a bit of a conundrum because the way they feel about Saudi Arabia and some of the things they've done from a humanitarian track record perspective is a little bit questionable. So you've got this country who is trying to diversify its economy radically because they know that petroleum is not going to last forever. And so they've seen games as one of those key sectors that they need to cultivate, which is, I think locally, that's great. I think that's really cool that they're doing that. And it's kind of helping elevate some of the other efforts in the Middle East region to kind of come up to speed. So I really like what's happening with that. But at the same time, it kind of becomes another China example where companies need to start thinking about, well, that's really cool, but how are we going to interact with Saudi Arabia? And is that going to affect our relationships with other countries? And that it's a very careful conversation they have to have.
When you bring up China, I'm sure that back in your days at Microsoft, that was one of the I guess areas that you would have to look at most intensely in terms of, well, obviously, the Taiwan issue, but
Yeah.
There are probably several other different things that you'd have to look at for any kind of product release in China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's many issues. I mean, the Taiwan piece is the obvious one. Also, the South China Sea is pretty obvious. But then you've got issues that are more subtle, like dealing with the Uyghur people in Western China, who have been kind of universally oppressed by the Chinese government. Also, issues like there's an issue that came up recently, a couple of years ago, where Genghis Khan was going to be highlighted in an exhibit in the Louvre in Paris, and China put pressure on them not to do it because Genghis Khan is a somewhat controversial figure in China, and they don't really want to see him highlighted. So the Chinese government actually put pressure on France to not do that.
That's a whole interesting conversation, because if you think about it, I think Genghis Khan killed more people in history than anybody else, right? But he's held up as a hero, right? And, you could think of some Western characters that maybe came from Germany or Austria that, are equated with evil, which they should be, right? But you had a guy that, he would go in and basically just leave a path of death all across the continent, stacking up skulls into pyramids that were hundreds of feet high. But he's somehow considered a hero by some, and the Louvre would actually want to have an exhibit about him, which is, it's kind of weird to get your mind around that.
Well, yeah, it is. I mean, at the same time, I can see how people in the region, there is a certain admiration for a non-white person being highlighted in history to that degree, even though, yes, he was quite an oppressor. But he also spread his culture across a massive swath of the world.
And his gene pool,
and his gene pool. So I was in Kyrgyzstan back in July, and Kyrgyzstan is a really interesting country because it was at the heart of the Mongol Empire back in the day. And the people there are kind of an interesting mix of, you've got a lot of people who are ethnic Russians because of, former Soviet Union, but then most of the people who are there look Asian, and they look like and they basically trace their roots back to the Mongol Empire and Genghis Khan. And so I don't think there's like a disdain for that. It's basically like, well, that's where we came from. That's basically our legacy.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And then to tie it all in together, Koreans and Japanese are both Mongolian, and then in Korea, the idea that Genghis Khan tried to invade Japan twice. Well, Genghis did, and then I don't remember which one it was. Maybe it was Kublai, or one of his grandsons tried to, failed because of the divine winds, the kamikaze, and basically the monsoons and stuff. But it's fascinating stuff. Let me ask you a couple more things here.
Yeah.
If somebody is interested in these issues, these kind of topics, what are some good resources for them?
Well, unfortunately, there's not a lot of resources specifically about culturalization out there yet. I mean, I've written several book chapters on the topic. I'm working on my own book, which hopefully someday will get done. It's hard because I travel to speak a lot, and I also have a lot of client work. So finding time to write is really challenging these days. Plus I have a startup that I co-founded during COVID, so that, adds to the pile. But like the localization handbook, the game localization handbook that came out, the second edition a few years ago, I wrote a chapter in there about culturalization. So if you're curious about the topic and just kind of from a high level, I would highly recommend taking a look at that, because I kind of wrote it to be sort of like for people who've never heard of it before and what it means. But other than that, I mean, like one of the things I think that really is helpful is like if you want to tune into content related disagreements, to put it nicely, you especially look on a lot of international news sources. Like I frequently look on the BBC, I look on Reuters and AP and several other news sources, where they will often highlight these stories about, like, for example, those films that were banned because of the map that appeared in the movie. And so you kind of explore those issues and kind of read what is the kind of the real mechanics behind that and what's the issue at hand. I think if you look at examples like that and look through the news, because there's plenty of examples, so you can do Google searches for, like banned film or something like that, or banned game. And I know even Wikipedia has a long article about games that were banned for various reasons. So I'd recommend, for example, start with that article and just go down and read like all of these examples about what the triggers were. Why were the games banned? Sometimes it's basic stuff. Like, there's what I call the big three that often happens, that is what ratings boards, like games rating boards in different countries, they look for sex, profanity, and violence. Those are the big three that they're mainly focused on. But some game ratings boards, like Korea, for example, they look beyond that. They're looking for the representation of the country, the political implications, cultural commentary, all kinds of things. So I would really encourage you look at an article like that and just kind of explore it and kind of see, where it takes you from there. Because I think we've all been down the Wikipedia rabbit hole and suddenly realize 4 hours have passed.
Yes, unfortunately, I've been there many, many times, but sometimes it's a lot of fun. Hey, actually, another question popped in my mind is because we've been talking about a lot of these kind of international examples of geopolitical issues that prevent the metaverse from being from being. Do you seen any examples here, just in the U.S. or North America, where a game publisher got into a little bit of hot water or had to backtrack a bit?
Yeah, I mean, there's been quite a bit, actually. I mean, one of the biggest challenges here in the US is a lot of times the cultural appropriation of indigenous culture. That happens quite a bit because, game developers, as well as any content developers, are often looking for the next cool thing that they can, be their inspiration. And so a lot of indigenous cultures around the world, but specifically also here in North America, are often targets of that because, let's face it, the indigenous cultures that are here, that were, obviously here long before any Europeans ever showed up, just have an incredibly rich culture that goes back for millennia. And there's really cool designs and other things that are part of their culture that we as like European based people or from other parts of the world look at that. We're just like, it's so cool looking. It's so different. If you think about like the Aztec designs or the Olmec in Central America, it's just a very unique style. And so oftentimes game developers will kind of cue in on that and say, that's what I want to use as the foundation for whatever I'm going to build. But the problem is oftentimes in the creative process, we often use allegory, whether it's a narrative or visual allegory, to imply that, hey, this culture is kind of like that culture in the real world, but it's not really. For example, any game I've ever worked on that has a desert environment, all the people look like they're basically Bedouin from the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, even if it's a fantasy game. So, and that could be a potential problem because, people who are playing the game may just assume that the people in that game world, even if it's a fantasy world, they say, well, they look like they're Arabs, but they're not. They're not supposed to be. So what we have to do is to employ what I call the allegorical distance. So you have to think about, okay, you start with that inspiration. So let's say it's some indigenous artifact or clothing or something, and you want to represent that in a game in, like, let's say it's a fantasy world that has nothing to do with the real world inspiration. That's okay. But it's like your creative process to get from here to here, from inspiration to implementation, has to be deep enough so that you make sure there's enough allegorical distance so that when somebody looks at your implementation, they're not going to automatically say, oh, yeah, that's from the Lakota Sioux tribe. I've seen that before. You don't want that to happen. So you can start with a real world inspiration, whether it's indigenous or something else, but you really have to put in the work to do the creative process to make sure that it's not going to be, somebody's going to see it and just automatically know what it is. And like one of the indigenous cultures that has been leveraged very heavily in recent years is the Maori in New Zealand. Yeah. A lot of games use Maori tattoos and other things on non-Maori characters because, let's face it, the Maori designs are amazing. They're very cool, but they're also, for that culture, extremely meaningful. And we can't just, use them without context. And so that's one of the cultures I've had to advise on quite a bit. And which is part of my process, is actually reaching out to people from the Maori culture and basically getting their input and getting their help to make it right.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, probably my last question was, because it's impossible for one person to know all different cultures and all different political and geopolitical issues and so on and so forth. So what do? You must have an amazing network of subject matter experts, or?
I do, yeah. So there's a lot of people in my network that I contact. I know, for example, a lot of people in different indigenous groups around the world who I can contact and get their input on. So I often either just do that as part of my process, or I actually subcontract the review work to them so I can get their input. So there's a lot of subject matter expertise as well that I have to leverage in certain contexts. So, for example, one of the games I'm working on right now is the Indiana Jones game that comes out. I don't know when, maybe next year. I don't know. But I had to outsource some pieces of the review to a couple of archaeologists in different parts of the world, because the game company is really dedicated to authenticity. They want the archaeology in the game to be very accurate, which I think is awesome. So that's part of what they used me for, was to source a couple of archaeologists so that they could actually have them review the content and make sure it's all correct.
I sometimes I have like a love-hate relationship with consultants, because I've had good and bad experiences. But I mean, we've been talking for about 45 minutes here, and again, my mind's just kind of like going, I'm just taking in so much information, and so I can see that the value that you bring to the table for your clients is impressive at a minimum. So I'm sure you're in high demand. If somebody wanted to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
The best way, they could just email me at Kate@Geogrify, geogrify.com. I also have a website, geogrify.com, although it's down right now. I'm getting it replaced with a whole new one, because the original site's from 2005. It's a nice internet artifact.
A lot of changes since then.
Yeah, it needs to be replaced. Or they can just find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn too.
Awesome. Well, hey, Kate, I really enjoyed this conversation as well. And thank you so much for being on memoQ Talks.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for joining memoQ Talks, where we talked with industry leaders about their experiences and lessons learned to gain new insights about what works best across all areas of localization. Join us next time on memoQ Talks.